Thank you very much, Mike. Good afternoon, everybody. Now, wait a second. So many of us have flown in from DC or flown in from across the country to be here with you and to talk about the really important political issues of the day. Let me try that again. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
That's more what I'm talking about. It's great to be back here, and I can't tell you what an honor and a privilege it is for me to return to USC. I had the thrill and the opportunity to work with the two directors, Mike Murphy and, of course, Bob Schrum, who run the Center for the Political Future, which is an amazing opportunity for students to work with political practitioners. I have to ask, are any of my students here? I'm actually, okay, well, that counts. That's it, now that counts. Oh, that counts. Okay, fine, thanks, Adam. See, now I feel a little bit better. But it's a thrill and an opportunity to return, given the topic that we're going to talk about in this panel today. There are so many serious issues, there are so many things that are confronting the political landscape that we wanted to bring together a group of experts, a group of people who could really tackle some of these very critical questions. And before I introduce our panel, I wanted to say that it astounds me that Gen Z and Gen X and the younger folks now are a larger voting bloc of the population of eligible voters than are the baby boomers, for one thing. And what will that sleeping bear now roused do? I mean, when I was here, we had voter registration drives at USC, and there were many, many students who were registering to vote, often in record numbers. I see this also teaching back at Georgetown this semester. How will these students, now awakened, impact the 2020 election cycle? And we'll soon see. And what are the other demographics that are in play for this election cycle? Will people of color largely stay at home, or will they come out being motivated to vote, motivated by an administration that, by and large, many people of color don't support? I also ask myself, what's going to happen with citizens in the upper Midwest? You look at Wisconsin, you look at Pennsylvania, you look at Ohio, you look at some of these critical states that helped deliver a victory for Donald Trump. Will they come out in force, or will they come out and deliver a victory for the eventual Democratic nominee? And I also look, and the Pew Center has some very interesting polling data that says that 1/3 of voters in this upcoming election will be non-white. The largest demographic of that is the Latino population, which is approximately 13%, which is a little bit more than the African-American population. How will that have an impact on this election? So, without further ado, I am going to start, and moving to my right, introduce our illustrious panel. We have Cesar Martinez, who is a Spanish language media strategist and expert, who has worked with President George W. Bush, my old boss, John McCain, and Mitt Romney. We have Professor Jane Junn to his right. She's a professor of political science here at USC in gender studies, and she's the USC Associate Chair in social sciences. We have two buddies of mine, so I'm going to try to keep this in the road here for the panel as well. We have Doug Thornell, who is a principal at SKD Knickerbocker. You know, I've never actually said that, and I wonder if you guys can say that like 3 times quickly without messing. Good. He's a former media strategist for the DNC, worked very strongly and very closely with Governor Howard Dean. And finally, we have Todd Harris, a longtime friend, former partner of mine and Mike Murphy's. He's a senior strategist, was a senior strategist for Senator Marco Rubio. Frankly, he's been a senior strategist for just about anybody I can think of on the Republican side. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is lovely to have you all here. And I want to start with the premise that I just threw out a few moments ago. When we look at the younger voters, and we look at the Gen Zs, and we look at the Gen X, and we look at those folks, and Cesar, I'm going to start with you. And I'd like each one of you to answer this, how do you think these younger voters who are now registered, who are out in force, how are they going to impact this election cycle?
Well, I think first I'm a Mexican, American, Texan, Californian.
Wow, you've got more going than everybody else.
I'm a boomer. I was born in 1963, so I might be one of the last boomers. And I had the opportunity of working with, as you mentioned, with President Bush and with McCain and Romney and Jeb. And one of the things that we discovered is the young generation I think one of the persons that really got it right first was Governor Bush at that time. When Governor Pete Wilson here in California was going against immigrants, Governor Bush was going like, hey, I need to talk to them. My former boss and mentor, Lionel Sosa, who worked with Ronald Reagan, you guys were mentioning, Reagan told him, hey, go and talk to Latinos. They're closer to Republicans than you might think. Just, they're conservative. They are small business owners, they're faith-based, and they don't like paying taxes. So it's one of those things that can, let's talk to them.
Yeah.
And everybody has been talking about Iowa.
Yep.
You haven't heard the Hispanic Iowa stories. I was there 20 years ago with Governor Bush. We were at the Straw Poll looking for delegates for him. And it was quite interesting to see the reaction. There was a younger generation there. I mean, and we Latinos are one, I mean, on the millennial side, there are more Latino millennials than boomers. So I'm of the old generation. And we saw it last year as well, I mean, in 2018, that if you talk to them, they will come. And I remember with George Bush, we talked to them. First, we got 33%, and then more than 40% on re-election because he was welcoming. So I think things are gonna change now. If we hear the message of welcoming, we will participate, but it's not gonna be as easy because we have an administration that is saying, hey, do not be part of this. But I think you'll be amazed, I'm pretty sure.
So you've got the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come, as it relates to the young people.
Well, it happened when the first event in Philadelphia that we did for the Republican convention, we called it Un Nuevo Día, a new day. And my big mouth, I said like, hey, how about if we do America the Beautiful bilingual? And my boss told me, really? So we tried, and we had Emilio Estefan singing it, Celia Cruz, everybody was welcoming this new generation that helps America grow. So I think in a way, whomever really tries to do more positive message, and I guess it's gonna be now on the Democrat side, if they go against the fear tactics and more like welcoming, you're part of the country, I think that's gonna resonate.
Jane, what resonates with you as it looks to younger voters and their participation in this new cycle?
Well, they're younger voters only if you're a boomer and above, right?
Yeah.
And I'd also just like to note that I'm sitting in the middle of this range of seats, which also signifies that I'm nonpartisan, so Democrats and Republicans have at it. At the same time, what I want to raise are some really basic, systematic issues that we shouldn't ignore, whether you're Democrat or Republican, so I don't have a party to support publicly. And I want to raise these within the context of how to think about this new group of voters. We all want maybe more Democrats or more Republicans to turn out or of this generation, but remember a few things about boomers. They are much more racially diverse. So you mentioned, I'm surprised that it's that high, a third of voters. It's certainly a third of the United States population is now something other than white, California much more so. But remember that it's young voters who are systematically much more minority simply as a function of immigration and birth rates among non-white Americans. So race is going to be more of a factor, which is exactly why we should be thinking about it. So we can't compare and look at models of voting, whether it's models of turnout or models of candidate preference and choice as we have in previous generations, because this is a new group of voters. I think the second thing we have to think about is much more structural and systematic. If we learned anything about 2016, that, of course, we knew this already, but parties and the candidates matter, but also the economy does as well. Remember that this newer generation, the younger, and those, I see a lot of younger people out here, hello to our students, that the economy is fundamentally different for you than it was for boomers, right? It's fundamentally different. It's less secure. You probably have a lot more debt. I don't want to remind you of that, but you probably have more debt. You have more insecurity, and many are probably working in things like a gig economy. That's not what baby boomers and above did. So remember that conceptions of safety net and the notion of what is the role of government may be more systematically welcoming to people who otherwise don't have that to fall back on. This is a generation of people, whether it's Gen X or Z, who cannot be assured that they will do better economically than their parents. This is probably good for the Democratic Party, would be my guess. At the same time, remember that what's happening structurally to the parties, is this the Republican Party today that you recognize from George Bush? It isn't.
No.
So remember that what we have in terms of the movement of parental socialization, of partisanship to their children may not happen in the same way. I think we are right now experiencing party realignment right underneath our feet. And we probably all know it. Republican Party doesn't look like it used to. It may stand for some of the same things, but it may not for others. And I think that's an opportunity for, in this generation, whether it's the younger, whether they're millennials or boomers or Gen Zs, where they are unmoored to parties in the way that boomers and the greatest generation before them have not been. I think these are structural features that we all understand and know, and that you should think about them systematically as you try to advocate for your party.
Doug, what's your take?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Look, I think that 2018, when Democrats won back the House, you could point to the suburbs as a reason, the increased turnout of people of color, but young voters really made a huge difference for Democrats that cycle. You saw, I think, the millennial participation nearly double. And Democrats had a concerted effort to reach out to young voters during that election. They recruited millennial candidates or close to millennial candidates, and they talked about issues that are really motivating millennials and I guess Gen Y.
Yeah, I think
Gen Z. All right.
Why now Z?
Climate change, gun violence, particularly, are very important issues to millennial voters, and those issues were front and center in a lot of these congressional races. Yes, healthcare was the dominant issue that was discussed, particularly in paid advertising, but if you look at what many of these House candidates were talking about on the trail, they were talking about these issues that connected with young voters, and they were going to where young voters are consuming their information. There's such a change in media consumption habits right now, particularly among young voters, that I'm a media consultant at my firm, and I know there are other media consultants here, that if you're not up on where young voters are getting their information, then you're not even going to reach them.
Wait, can I stop you on that?
Yep.
So where are they getting their information from? Is it Twitter? Is it Snapchat? I mean, I am so socially media illiterate. Like, where are they getting their information?
Well, they definitely over-index on Snapchat, on Instagram. They're not reading hard copy newspapers anymore or watching the 6 o'clock news as much as they did in the past. They are getting it online. Facebook. I mean, Facebook is a driver for many different age groups, but particularly for young voters. And it's going to be incumbent upon whoever the Democratic nominee is for Trump, for others, to figure out how to have a compelling message that gets to where these folks are. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to connect with them, because your traditional ways of reaching voters, whether it's broadcast TV or even cable, that's not where a lot of young voters are getting their information right now. So I think it's what we saw in 18, which was a concerted effort by Dems to both figure out the right issues as well as the right ways to reach voters. That's going to be critical for whoever is our nominee, and they've got to build on what we did, or we're not going to win.
Mr. Bruin?
Well, the good news for anyone who's interested in millennial participation in politics is that you will almost certainly see record numbers of younger voters this cycle, just like you did in 2018. The context, though, I think is important, because you're going to see record numbers of just about every voting group across the board this cycle. And you tend to see in 2018, there's been a lot of focus about the number of young voters, but it was also true that there were record-setting numbers of voters that cycle across the board as well. The forecasts are for this cycle that we could have as many, for context, in 2016, there were about 136 or so million votes. We're looking this year at maybe as much as 156, 157 million. And so turnout across the board is going to be through the roof. And we know this because when you ask people today, how interested are you in voting in this election, surveys today show that the percent of voters who say they are 10 out of 10 extremely, or maybe 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 extremely interested in voting, it's about 75%. At this point in the 2016 cycle, that number was at about 50%. And so you are going to see record-breaking young voter turnout, but turnout is going to be huge across the board, and it's going to be because of Trump. So the question is, does this continue post-Trump? Is this the new norm with young voters? Because what you have with the Trump phenomenon, it's sort of like Newton's third law of motion, where for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Everything that Trump does that fires up 10 people over here, he is turning off and repelling 10 people over there. And so that's why you're seeing across the board this incredible level of interest in the election. What I think, as I said, will be fascinating is how much of it endures.
And I was going to ask this question a little bit later on, Todd, but I'll stick with you on this. You know, one of the key demographics for President Trump in his victory was college-educated white women. And I just wonder, and we'll start with you and then come down with the panel, do you think a lot of his antics have turned off this key constituency that helped propel him to the White House in the first place?
Well, I'm not sure college-educated white women. I would say when you're looking at white women in the 2016 in terms of the 2016 results, I think you have to look at them. The white women that fueled Trump's victory were non-college educated and college-educated white married women, because college-educated single women, in terms of their voting behavior, it's like a completely, they look very little like college-educated married women. And so the two groups that really helped fuel Trump's win in 2016, well, non-college educated whites just across the board, especially in the upper Midwest, but I think we'll talk more about that in a bit. I see very little evidence that college educated married white women and non-college educated white women, I see very little evidence of them peeling away from Trump in appreciable ways. Where Trump is going to have real problems is college-educated women and more suburban women in general.
Jane, you had the look like you wanted to jump right in on that.
Well, I think I don't know what data you're looking at, but I believe that the college-educated white female vote is divided equally between Clinton and Trump by most exit polls, and if anything, there's just a slight edge for Clinton among the college-educated white women. But I'm very curious what you think, or just what everybody thinks. What is it about being married that makes white women go Republican? Now, because these college-educated single women, they're going to get married. The next day, do they just decide, oh, I guess I'm a Republican today because I'm married? No, that's not the reason why. So what do you think is going on with that? I have to agree with you. I don't think that there's going to be any significant difference between what white women did in 16 and what they will do in 20, because white women have been consistently supporters of the Republican Party since 1952. I don't remember if it was this conference or not, I mean, obviously not this one now, but a few years ago, I think I might have posed the question, in how many elections have white women voters in the United States supported Democrats by a majority? So there are 18 elections between 1952 and 16, and how many of those elections did white women support Democrats by a majority? Thank you. And that is exactly right, and that's not surprising anymore. 4 years ago, people thought that was crazy, but that is in fact the correct answer. So to suggest that there should be a sea change, what are those 2 years? Do you know? Nope. 96 and 64. Barry Goldwater and LBJ. So, but I think it's 96, it's not 92. So those are the two elections in which white female voters, college educated or not, supported Democrats by a majority. Those are the only two elections in which they did. And in the last 3 election cycles against President Obama as the Democrat and Hillary Clinton as the Democrat, all of those Republicans won the majority of white women's votes. So I have to agree that I don't see any sea change in that, but I do want to put out there for you to talk about over a cocktail, what is it about being married for white women that makes them Republican?
On that note, gentlemen, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that
No, not that.
I won't weigh on that.
It is ironic that there are 4 men on this panel, isn't it?
But you're in the middle, as you pointed out.
Look, Democrats did make some improvements with white women in 2018 during the midterms. I think the question is whether or not that is something that can be transferred to a presidential election. A lot of those gains, a lot of those gains were in suburban districts where, it was clear that there was just an exhaustion factor with Trump. Even though the economy is, reported on as being strong, there was a sense that, this sort of never-ending cycle of crisis was just getting to be too much for a lot of these voters. And so I think that's, the candidates that Democrats ran in 2018 were pragmatic. They were not trying to push for radical change. They were pushing for common sense solutions, healthcare, lowering healthcare costs, prescription drugs, dealing with gun violence, combating corruption. And these were issues that I think in many voters' minds, and I think women's minds as well, based off of what I've seen in focus groups, was just like sort of like a sense of returning to a sense of normalcy that a lot of voters are craving. And so I think whoever, it's going to be important that whoever the Democrats nominate, that I think that they learn a lot of the lessons from 2018 because it was just a year and a half ago. And also some of the lessons that were we can take from 2019 when Democrats won 2 governorships in ruby red states. They won total control of Virginia. And those candidates were running on a record of, pragmatism, important, incremental change, but something that every voter could sort of feel comfortable with.
Well, I got some bad news for Donald Trump. Wait till you see a Latina mom react this year, when you badmouth her son or her husband. I think Latinas are going to be very key participating. And again, they're going to be very vocal. And I think it's in a way, it's if you start dissecting and you start dividing, I think moms, especially in Latino households, mom sets the rules. I mean, she's really a big decision factor. So I think we're going to see a huge number of Latinas participating in this process.
Well, let me stick with you on that because most of us up here, I'm happy to say, we're just days away from Iowa, and I'm glad that we're here in Southern California and that we're not in Iowa, particularly in January. It's just a joy, let me assure you. But as we look at some of the key demographics, some of the key voting blocks, each one of you, who do you kind of have your eye on as a important demographic that our audience should keep in mind as we look to see who's going to become the next president of the United States? And we'll start with you.
Well, I might say Latinos. I mean,
You
we've been
might say
preaching for
that.
this for 20-something years or more. But honestly, being that we're going to be the second largest voting bloc in the country, as this year. And really, I mean, I think in a way, last year we did something. For midterm elections, Latinos were participating at a very low number, really the lowest. And our spokesperson to bring Latinos into the polls were Donald Trump. We actually did an ad that was called Stop Trumpadas. Trumpada in Spanish, Luis is going to know, trumpada means a slap on the face. We did focus groups and Latinos were saying, when I hear the president, I feel like it's a slap on the face. And we did an ad that literally we were showing people being slapped on the face while the president was talking. And first they said, wow, that's too much. We said, well, that's the way they feel. They told us on focus groups. And we asked the question, and we said, well, does this make you want to register and vote? It went through the roof, like 82% or so. So in a way, you saw that it doubled the participation of Latinos. So I think it's overall Latinos will participate, but I think Latina moms will be surprising, and of course, a younger generation as well, because they see that their parents might be deported, that they're dividing families. I mean, it's completely a different set. So I think that's going to be a lot of reaction, as you were mentioning, Todd, the reaction of an action.
Professor, what do you think?
I think these guys are going to have a lot to say about specific groups, but I'm going to talk about just two things. One, I think we need to think more systematically about Asian American voters. That's an area that I specialize in. And as someone noted on an earlier panel, I believe it was Carla, noted that there are twice as many Asian Americans in California than there are African Americans. It's striking. It's sort of happened without us knowing about it, or not us knowing about it, but it's sort of happened without much change politically. It's a very important new demographic group. Certainly for California, but also for other locations. Asian Americans today are, in the United States, adults are about 3/4 foreign born, but that doesn't mean that they're not registered. It doesn't mean that they don't participate. This is a group to watch, perhaps not one that will be consequential in specific locations, or across the country rather, but in specific locations. I'll give you places like Virginia, possibly other locations where California, they'll certainly be important. They were definitely so in Los Angeles County and Orange County in the 2018 elections. The other point that I want to make, and I think it's worth clarifying, I'm sorry to be the professor here, but I am, and
Somebody's got to do it.
yes, and I think it's important for us to remember that each election has a unique electorate. So when you're talking about 18, that's one set of elections, some in competitive states, some in none, and each electorate is different with each election. So in my town, in Pasadena, we had an election which I sadly forgot to vote in, but I will in 20. At each time, even if they're only separated by 6 or 8 months, they're separate elections, and therefore, we should always be thinking not only about candidate choice and party support, we must always be thinking about mobilization. Who's going to bring out the voters? I think the discussion around millennials and specific racial and ethnic groups is important because we're counting on them, if you're a Republican, one way, or if you're a Democrat, another way. But we have to think not only about which candidates people support and why they do so, but which of those candidates are going to either activate mobilization or demobilize voters. So that distinction is a crucial one, mobilization and turnout versus candidate choice.
Doug.
So I think there are a couple different demographics I'm going to be looking at, but the stay-at-home voter, and that may not be the right term for them, but that's what I've sort of came up with. And these are the folks who don't vote, but they're yelling and screaming about issues that they care about, but they don't go out and vote. And 4 out of 10 registered voters didn't vote in 2016. They over-indexed to folks who were less affluent, less educated, more non-white, and more Democratic. And there was a reason why they did not come out and vote. And it's incumbent upon, our nominee to figure out how they can motivate those folks to come out. Barack Obama won Michigan in 2012 with 350,000 votes, and Hillary Clinton lost it by 13,000. A lot of that was because there was a drop in turnout in Wayne County and Saginaw County, and Democrats are just going to have to figure out what they need to do to treat those voters not necessarily as GOTV voters, and that's we call them get out the vote voters, and they're historically been voters that campaigns communicate with very late in a cycle. I think you need to look at them more as persuadable voters because you're trying to persuade them from not necessarily voting for Trump. These folks are not going to vote for Trump, but they just may not vote. And so if you come up with a program that treats them in that way and communicates with them early, make sure that they feel like their vote counts and you're giving them a reason to vote, then I think the numbers that we saw in 16 will dramatically change. And so I think those are the voters that I'm going to be eyeing.
So I want to follow up with you on that. I mean, you look at President Obama's two victories, and you had people of color coming out in record numbers. You had young people coming out. Do you think that there is a sense that a lot of people of color might just well stay at home because they don't see someone on the stage for the Democrats who look like them or like them? Because you remember, we had the most diverse Democratic group in history running for president, and now we've got the Byrne and we've got Elizabeth Warren, and frankly, we've got a bunch of older white folks.
Yeah, but I would say that for many years before Barack Obama, African Americans voted for white candidates for president. So it's not, and in many cycles did it with a ton of enthusiasm. So, no, look, I think what's driving African American voters right now, and there was a good Washington Post Ipsos poll that came out a couple weeks ago that surveyed registered African American voters, and they see Donald Trump as a real threat, and they think it's 80, well over 85, 87% of them think it's very important that he is defeated, and then on an intensity scale, 77% of those folks feel like it's extremely important, and so. I don't think it really. I think if you look at the candidates running right now, I think you are seeing a good amount of enthusiasm for Joe Biden's campaign among particularly older African Americans, and with Bernie, he's doing pretty well with African American millennials. So I don't think it's going to necessarily matter that the nominee is not going to be a person of color. I think what is driving many Democrats, and included in that are African Americans, is the sort of crisis that is this president and the fact that he needs to be defeated.
Thank you. I was thinking of something pithy to come back to about the crisis that is this president, but I decided I'm just going to punt it along to Todd.
So I would say, we talked a second ago about how we're sort of living in a time of political realignment, and with that as the context, I would say that in the era of Trump, one of the most important indicators that you can look at to determine vote performance is education level. College-educated white suburban voters used to be the bedrock of the Republican Party. Today, you have seen a huge swing, and this is largely what fueled Trump's victories in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. Non-college educated white voters who used to be very reliable Democrats are now voting Republican. The percentage of college-educated voters that make up the base of the Republican Party has shrunk significantly over the last 10 years. And this is fueling a lot of why Republicans are having problems in the suburbs and why a bigger and bigger percentage of our margins are coming from rural areas. So, I would be looking at education level. I would also be paying attention to something that doesn't get, a group of voters that don't get talked about a lot because they are not in any way monolithic, but I think we can all agree that what we are about to endure over the next 10 months is going to be horrifically ugly. Yeah. And in 2016, you had anywhere from 15 to 17% of all voters who had a negative opinion of both candidates on election day. Those voters broke for Trump. So I would be paying close attention to voters who don't like either Trump or whoever the Democrats nominate, and because they don't like either one, they can oftentimes be hard to kind of pin down because they don't show up in surveys the way that that hardcore partisans on both sides would show up. So I'd be looking at them and be curious as to whether they would break again for Trump, or this time are they going to break against him. And then a final group that I'd be paying attention to, and again, nothing happens in politics in a vacuum. And so depending on who the Democrats nominate, a group like Hispanic men either might perform exactly the way that you think that they would and predominantly vote Democratic, or if the Democrats nominate someone like Elizabeth Warren, someone like Bernie Sanders, when you look at focus groups specifically of Hispanic men, the ideas of socialism, that is something that resonates very deeply and in a very negative way. And I'm not saying that Trump would carry anywhere near a majority of Hispanic men, but he could pick up enough to really make a difference, especially given how close his margins were in the battleground states.
Does the distinguished gentleman to my right have anything to say about that?
Well, actually, to add into Todd's, in 2000, remember that in Florida, everybody remembers Florida, the difference was 537 votes. George Bush got 2,000 more Latino votes than Al Gore. That made a difference. And Florida, big battle state, if you use the word socialism, trust me, everybody's gonna mean, if Venezuelans can register and vote now, they will jump into it. So in a way, yep, you're right. I mean, that men will be a big part of that. Talking about that group, right now with Latinos, we have 15 to 18 million US Latino citizens that haven't registered to vote. So they really, really can make a difference. I'm not as smart as Mike Murphy, so I have to do my numbers, and I have to write them down.
But you have them.
Yeah, but I did one thing. It's just think Pennsylvania. And I remember it's pretty much, the difference in there was 0.7% in the last presidential election. Latinos are 7% of the population. There's 440,000 eligible ones to vote. The difference was less than 50,000 votes on that state. If Latinos register, everything changes. I mean, but again, let's see, they're not going to split automatically Democrat. So it's in a way the messaging as well could be the big difference.
So Jane, I want to start with you on this next question. You know, you look back at 1992 and it was dubbed the year of the woman. What do you think when we come out of this 2020 election cycle, what are they going to dub 2020, the year of what?
I don't know, the man. Hopefully, I do want to, sorry to be so flip about that, I do want to argue that every election lately is the year of the woman. I mean, who's the modal voter in American politics today? By modal voter, I mean, what's the largest group, male, female, and binary, non-binary too, but what's the largest group of voters in the American electorate today? Right, exactly. By about how much, you know, it's like really lopsided, like colleges and universities today, they're like 56% female. You know that, right? Except for the exclusive ones. They're about 50-50, but it's about almost 54% female is the population of voters. Now, what was it in 1964? Close your eyes. Think of the modal voter in 1964. Who do you see? I see Don Draper, right? Right? So 1964, he's a white guy. He's the modal voter. Is that true? Most political scientists will tell you that's true. Probably most political consultants. Is a white man the modal voter in 1964? Guys?
No, I don't think so.
Nope.
No, he's not. The modal voter is more like Betty Draper. She's white, she's female, she lives in the suburbs, she's Republican, she owns a gun. And she has kids, right?
Yep.
That's what the modal voter was in 1964, and she remains so today. So I think in some interesting ways, calling 1992 of the year of the woman is just a rearticulation of what elections are every year. They are driven by female voters. And it's not just a function of the slightly smaller proportion of men in the electorate due to mortality rates. It's because women turn out to vote more regularly and consistently than men do. So every year is the year of the woman in American politics.
Hey, I'm just psyched that we got a Mad Men reference that Betty Draper is actually the protagonist voter. So thank you for that. Gentlemen, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I think I'm not sure about what. For me, it's a little early to put a label on this election without knowing who our nominee is. But I do think one of the important tug of wars that we should be paying attention to, and I think will be a storyline coming out of the election, is the rural communities versus suburban communities. Yeah. I think we have seen, we saw in the most recent elections that in Kentucky, in Louisiana, even in Mississippi, which we didn't win but came pretty close, that Dems did extremely well in the suburbs, but those races were kept close by how well Republicans were doing in rural communities. And in 2020, I think one of the key things for both House Democrats who are up for re-election and in the presidency is going to be how well Democrats can do, and can they do better, even better in the suburbs, to compensate for what I think is going to be a huge turnout by voters in rural communities for the president.
Todd, Cesar?
I don't think any voter group is going to want to claim responsibility for the 2020 cycle. I honestly don't know. I mean, it could be the year of the extremes, the year of rampant tribalism, polarization. I agree with Doug. You're going to see an urban-rural divide that's likely exacerbated. It'll be your surprises. The one thing I can be assured of is whatever we think is going to happen today is probably not what's going to happen.
That's 100% true.
I think it might be a replay of 2000 in Florida. To be honest, I think it's going to be again so key. I mean, remember 2016, again, my numbers on, it was the difference, 1.2 that Trump won. And last year, it was also very, very, very close. And I think Florida is going to play big time. And again, Latinos in there, that you have a group that it's not going to be leaning, I mean, it leans more Democrat, but it might go Republican if there's too much socialism word going on in there. I think Florida will be, again, kind of like a movie that we saw. We're going to see it again.
As long as we don't have hanging chads, dimpled chads, and swinging chads in Florida,
electronic stuff now.
I think we'll be in much better shape. By the way, I keep looking at all these numbers. It's like the Tim Russert whiteboard over here with these numbers. Betsy will appreciate that. So moving ahead, we spent so much of our discussion talking about domestic policy and some of these domestic issues. I'm very interested to hear what the panel has to say about foreign policy. How will foreign policy impact some of these groups, the millennials, the older folks, the people in the upper Midwest? Is what President Trump has done, and I look specifically at tariffs, right? I mean, his path to victory, many would say, was through the upper Midwest, and yet his tariff war with China, you might argue, very well has hurt the demographic who got him into office. Doug, we'll start with you. What do you think about foreign policy in the 2020 election?
So in the primary, the Democratic primary, foreign policy, national security really hasn't been a major topic of conversation nor a key issue for voters, except for the last, I think, week or two with the conflict with Iran. And I think for certain candidates, that helped sort of allow them to sort of flex their foreign policy and national security experiences, whether that was Joe Biden or whether that was Mayor Pete. I think that was the first time in this campaign where it actually, I think, made a little bit of a difference. I think things have sort of reset a bit. But, I think in the general, I think that I've just been surprised about how the tariff issue hasn't hurt Trump more. You know, I've looked in on focus groups in places where you would think that these people would be really angry.
Yeah.
But there's sort of a forgiveness among a lot of these Trump voters in Wisconsin and other places where they're getting hit hard. You know, these farms are, you know, going bankrupt. But there hasn't been a connection or a leveling of blame against the president that I would have expected. I also don't think that you've seen Democrats prosecute the issue of tariffs very well, or if at all. There are reasons why that is the case, with labor dynamics as you know, being one driver, but with the exception of some groups within the Democratic Party, they just haven't been mounting that critique of the president. So I think it's going to be largely an election that is going to be decided on you know, domestic issues, healthcare, and the economy, but you can expect there to be a moment or two with a foreign policy crisis like we saw with Iran that pops up that the nominee and the president are going to have to manage, much like President Obama had to manage with Benghazi in 2012 and Mitt Romney had to deal with. Yep. So it's definitely going to come up, but I think it's probably not going to be a major driver of what voters decide in November.
I just wanted to jump in on the tariff issue. I do a lot of work in Iowa. The governor of Iowa is a client of mine. Joni Ernst is a client of mine, and so I spend a lot of time there. There is zero evidence that those most impacted by the tariffs are making any sort of break from the president. When you talk to farmers, they are willing to give him all of the maneuvering room in the world that he needs because they like the idea that he is standing up to China. What is interesting is that to the degree that there are any cracks at all in the Trump ag coalition, at least in Iowa, has nothing to do with trade. It's about RFS, because the Renewable Fuel Standard. There are farmers there that felt that he was not pro-ethanol enough and that he sold out to big oil. And that did upset a lot of people. But standing up to China, he gets credit for it, actually.
Professor.
I think that voters, for the most part, don't know very much about foreign policy. They have difficulty in general, whether educated or not, identifying countries on a map, locations of the world, and this is just, in essence, partially an American problem or circumstance, but foreign policy issues are episodic almost by definition to voters, and absent something very significant happening, I think it, and based on whatever evidence has been discussed today, unlikely to affect voters. I did want to return to something Cesar mentioned, and that is his prediction that we're going to look like Florida in 2000. Help us all, right? Having said that, what I do want to point out is that one of the things that both of the parties have done, and maybe one more successfully than the other, is attempted to reconsider the structural and institutional rules of registration and voting itself. So Florida is a very good example. The voters in Florida recently passed a constitutional amendment that would re-enfranchise previously disenfranchised voters. And the re-enfranchisement of those voters is not happening in a consistent way by party. So in other words, the Democrats have been much more successful in re-enfranchising the voters. And if there's maybe 1 million of them or 800,000 of them, that distinct balance as a function of whatever mobilizing strategies and effectiveness with local judges that the Democrats are using will benefit them in a very tight race. So if you're considering it to be tight, on the flip side, there are also efforts to disenfranchise people as a function by parties or other local groups by putting polling places far away, by requiring voter ID, not just in Texas, but in many locations. And so I think we have to consider also the structural reforms that are either pro-voting or restricting voting that are occurring on the ground. In my sense, the Democrats are being probably a little bit more successful in reopening that. So if you're a Democrat, you might like that, and you might think that money has been well spent by the DNC.
Well, just to add on foreign policy on the Latino segment, it is important, being that in a way, if you're calling Mexicans rapists and drug dealers, it makes something, it's an impact when you're saying that. Also, one thing that I think Trump might play is the Venezuela card later on the election, and that will be a big influence.
Tell us about the Venezuela card.
Well, in a way, you know, Juan Guaido is the leader of the Congress there. He's going around the world saying that, hey, I'm the actual president of Venezuela, while Maduro, who's ruined the country, bringing it down into flames, and the hyperinflation is really not very well liked by the rest of the continent, in fact. So I think you'll be amazed. This might be that we get a Venezuela surprise, not in October, not in September, or somewhere around that, but it could be something that makes, sorry to say it again, Florida in play.
All roads seemingly lead back to Florida. Did you want to say something else, Doug?
No.
You had that look like you're, okay. So one thing that has really struck me, I've looked at this and I've looked at the data, and I've seen 3 recent polls, one from Marist, one from Emerson, one from Rasmussen, that seem to indicate that Trump could have as much as 30% of the African American community support. And I look at that, and Todd's look is exactly what I had. And I was like, I don't.
If Trump gets over 20% African American support, I will wear a USC sweatshirt for the next year.
Hey, this is being recorded, Todd, so just so you know, we might hold you to that. But I looked at that and I said, there's just no way that that level of support, I believe, is that high. And since you had that lovely look on your face, we'll start with you, Todd. What do you think the levels actually are? Is it greater than 10 and less than 20? Is it above 20?
I think if the Trump campaign could break, I think people on the Trump campaign would tell you that if they break 10%, that they would feel very, very good about that. If they broke 20%, most of these other conversations that we're having would be moot because he's going to win. I don't see it in the cards. I don't think anyone. I've seen those surveys. I'm very, very suspect. It's just not going to happen.
Well, we'll hear what Doug has to say next. But I agree with you.
So the poll I mentioned before, the Washington Post Ipsos poll that was released a couple weeks ago, shows that 83% of African Americans think the president's a racist, that any one of the top 5 or 6 Democrats who are contending for the nomination would beat him handily, and he would only get 4% of the vote. His approval rating is around 4 or 5%, according to this poll. So unless there is some sort of monumental, extraordinary, cataclysmic event that occurs, I think Trump is not. Trump did 8%, 9% with African Americans in 2016. He's not. I don't think he's going to do that. Now, that's not to say other Republicans, can't or won't do well with African Americans. Or I just think this is unique. I think in many ways this is right now unique with Trump and everything he has said and done throughout his term that African Americans find both humiliating, offensive, and, as I said earlier, a threat to their long-term security, both safety and economic security. So I don't see any way that he gets anywhere near 15%. I certainly don't think he's going to get. I don't think he's going to get above 10.
Jane?
I have to agree there, and I think that it's also useful to not consider even African American voters a monolith. They are not. You can see pockets and locations where Republican voting occurs at higher rates than it does across the United States. They're simply averaged out across many states and specific localities. Other candidates that are Republican besides Trump might do, as Doug said, better. I do think that one of the most important divides among African American voters is by sex. African American women are the absolute stalwart of the Democratic Party. They never not support Democrats below 95%. It is African American men who are the more likely ones to defect to the Republican Party. And you can see this across the board. The gender gap is as significant among African Americans, male and female, with African American women strongly supporting Democratic candidates compared to African American men. You might see something like 15% among African American men, but never among African American women. They are the stalwart, the base of the Democratic Party, not only in terms of their consistency of vote for Democratic candidates, but their turnout numbers. They are the ones on whose backs Doug Jones won the Senate seat in Alabama.
If I could just
Sure.
add it, and I totally agree with that, and I should have made the distinction, the gender distinction. I actually think Trump will do better writ large among African American voters this year than he did 4 years ago, and I think the reason for that is going to be fueled by African American men. This will probably make some people's heads explode, but if you view Trump not as a political figure, but more as a cultural one, there are a lot of voters and a lot of non-white voters who are very uncomfortable with the direction that our culture is heading, especially the culture here in California, the culture on the East Coast. These voters, it's one of the reasons why so many Trump supporters are so enthusiastic about him, not because of him as a political figure, but to them he represents like a bulwark against this change in culture that they don't agree with. And I've seen not a ton of data, but I have seen data that shows with Hispanic men and African American men, you see these spikes when asked about whether they're comfortable with the changes in culture that are occurring in our country.
I just want to say one last thing. I actually think that with African American men, I think that my bigger concern is not so much that they would somehow vote for Trump. They probably, there may be a couple points more with them versus African American women. My bigger concern is that they won't turn out, and that's what we saw in 2016. With a very stealth campaign run by probably Russians and in Trump's efforts, but to get out there in the ecosystem and Reddit and like a lot of these places, the whole attack on Hillary Clinton for her comments about the super predator and the crime bill, and these things did have an impact. It's around the margins, but when you only lose Michigan by 10, 13,000 votes or whatever, it all matters. So to me, it's less about them going to Trump. It's more about persuading them to come out and vote.
If we create a new set of, go ahead, Todd.
Well, I was just going to add on Michigan, just to further Doug's point. There was actually a 75,000 ballot under ballot for president in Michigan. Yeah. And so 75,000 people showed up to vote for other offices, but did not vote for president in Michigan. And when you think about the fact that Trump only won by 13,000 votes, yeah. There were, and this gets back to my previous point about people who don't like either candidate. It can make a difference.
I didn't bring my Michigan Latino numbers, I'm sorry. But in a way, it's, again, if we create a new set of voters, things will change. If it stays the same, it won't. And talking about men, for the record, I'm not planning to vote for Donald Trump, but I have friends, Latino friends, that are voting for Trump. I'm voted for Trump because the economy is doing good for them. So in a way, if he would keep his message on the economy rather than division, would sail into the election. But I think definitely what's going to happen is if people come out to vote, things will change. If not, we'll have another panel like this soon.
30 seconds, we got to get to Q&A.
I wish we would have had more time to talk about this, and that is, Trump's not running against a glass of water. He's running. He's going to be running against someone. I wish we would have had maybe people can raise it. We could discuss it very briefly, or you might cover it in the final panel. Is how are voters going to react to a woman candidate again from the Democratic Party? I think that these go to the essential questions of how analysts can think about electability and how gendered that the kind of calculation is. I'd like to have, if possible, a little bit of a discussion on that, what people think about the extent to which having such a what he would describe himself as a hyper masculinized candidate, again running against then who's coming in on the Democratic side. So he's running against somebody, and the question for us, I think, on this panel about voters, we should at least say a little bit about what does that mean if he faces a male or a female. How important is that? Is it not important? I think it's important.
Thank you very much. So now this is a fun time, the Q&A time, the Q&A segment where I get to roam around Oprah style. So
You're going to give away a car or something?
as long as you'll pay for it. I would ask that questions are questions and not statements, and that questions end with a question mark on them. And our staff, if they can raise their hands, who have microphones. If you will wait for a microphone to come, and they will come to you. And we will start with the gentlelady in the back right here wearing the pink, looks like, shirt with the blue sweater. Thank you for being with us.
All right, you hold it. I'm Diane Wallace. I have a question for the panel, back onto the topic of this panel, looking at boomers and millennials. Full disclosure, I'm an elected delegate to the California Democratic Party and have been since 2010. We're discussing the importance of taking back the Senate, and I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about boomers and millennials and whether they think that's a priority.
Who wants to take a stab at that? Douglas Thornell?
Whether boomers and millennials think winning back the Senate is a priority. That's an interesting question. So I think if you look at the Republican Party, for years, I think they did a very good job of emphasizing the importance of the Supreme Court. And they were able to, in many Senate races, connect the Supreme Court to the Senate race and had success in those Senate races. I think Democrats have had a harder time coming up with a compelling message on the Supreme Court and connecting it to Senate races. And what I think you saw with Republicans is that issues like choice, like guns, like religion, they were able to motivate folks to turn out in critical Senate races. I think that I don't think I've seen the same thing from the Democratic Party. I think that choice is obviously an incredibly important issue to our party, and for many voters, it's a single issue. But I think overall, the importance of winning back the Senate has not been put at the same level as the presidency. And I think that it's not just the Senate. I think it's also state legislatures where we have started to make some progress back. But the importance of winning state legislatures, even winning, obviously winning the House, that was critical in 2018. But turnout in 2014, we potentially could have won it then, and it was very low. And so, I think that we're making some progress there, but I think that there just tends to be among Democratic voters a much greater enthusiasm even in a presidential year to turn out for that presidential race than in a midterm to vote for control of the Senate or the House. And it makes it it requires a lot more of an investment to turn those voters out to win back the Senate and to win back the House than I think certainly than you see in presidential years. And I think it's important, but I don't think it's a huge thing that drives Democrats right now.
Let's go on this side of the room. The gentleman in the NASA shirt, feeling very space-like today.
Hi, thank you. Yes. So I just wanted to ask about the 2016 election. I think a big issue that decided the race in those upper Midwestern states was the issue of trade. Trump railed against outsourcing, railed against trade deals. I'm wondering whether you think Bernie Sanders' position on those trade deals, which is actually, he outflanks Trump on them. He's even more against the deals than Trump is, whether you think that could actually be an asset in a general election if Bernie were to be the nominee.
Panel?
I could only hope that Bernie would be the nominee. Sure, in those couple of states, narrowly speaking, Bernie's view on trade would probably help, but it would be so completely eclipsed by pretty much everything else that he believes, that in the context of those voters that you're talking about, who would be so totally turned off by the rest of his platform, that it wouldn't go well for Democrats.
I actually think in those states, yes, trade was important, but I think actually for Trump it was immigration.
And adding to that, it's he changed NAFTA to USMC, pretty much rebranded the same thing. And I don't think it's going to be, I mean, it will be mentioned, but not the game changer.
This side of the room. Question, the gentlelady right there.
So you've been talking a lot about how age, gender, and ethnic groups have like a larger impact in this 2020 election. But I'm wondering what your opinion is on which group will have more weight in deciding the topics of concern for the rest of this decade.
Jane. She wasn't expecting that.
You mean which groups will forward policy? Is that what?
And kind of deciding like which issues for them are their sort of main focus. And I can see like in a lot of the last election, it was a lot on trade and immigration. And then it's kind of the same thing, I feel, a little bit in this election, but then also in the next decade, what groups will determine what those issues are and what politicians should focus more on?
Well, that's such a big question. It's a very good one. It's a big question, though, and I think that what you have to do is consider that, like, millennials compared to boomers, the youngest boomers are my age, right? The youngest boomers are 1963. So that means that in 10 years, those boomers are going to be even older. So likely, if you want to look at a demographic group or sets of demographic groups, my sense is it's going to be people who are younger, millennial and younger. It will be more people of color, and it will be women.
The gentlelady right here in the powder blue sweater, followed by the lady sitting next to her, or behind her.
Oh, okay. One thing about the college-educated white women who are married versus single, how does that break down on age lines? Because I would feel like, you know, married women are more likely to be older, or older people, married women are more likely to be older, and a 55-year-old is more likely to vote conservative than a 25-year-old woman. But, so that's one. And then the second question is, obviously electability and whether a woman is electable has been a big topic of conversation recently. You just brought it up. And there's a lot of data that says, or research that shows that women actually don't fare worse than men in these different races. Like, I think women outperformed men in 2018. But I find that research hard to square with the comments I'm hearing about Elizabeth Warren. People are, she's cranky and like screeches and we don't like her, et cetera. Do you think that there's something specific about the office of the presidency that makes sexism appear more like people are less willing to risk losing the presidency, so they're less willing to vote for a woman because they believe other people are also not going to vote for a woman. So it's kind of like that compounded sexism.
Boy, that's a lot there. Who wants to take that one?
Look, I think you could make a good case that people are cranky and screechy now. You know, you could make that case. You could make that case about other, I mean, if anybody's a screamer, it's Bernie Sanders, right? So I think that what we have is you have some interpretations that are heavily gendered. When women do things that patriarchy says they shouldn't do, like stand up and speak up, be active, be successful, do all the things that they can do, these are considered violations to femininity. And in that context, you could argue that there could be issues of electability. No one would have predicted, I think, who said it? Everything that you thought was going to happen didn't happen last time. I would like everybody to remember that in 2016, Hillary Clinton won that election within the context of the popular vote by, 3 million votes? So the United States, the people of the United States who voted did not reject her because she was a woman. They voted for her. She lost in the Electoral College by small numbers and in a perfect storm where certain other voters then overmobilized. I don't think going forward that there necessarily has to be more that a woman is not electable, and nor is it the case that women support women vote candidates just because they're women. Women support candidates because they are consistent with the policy positions they have. Women aren't voting because they like her hair or her earrings or something. So therefore, your question is complicated, but so is the answer, and that is that if you disagree with the disciplining of Elizabeth Warren or Amy Klobuchar, write some, I don't think anybody uses Facebook anymore, at least nobody under 25. Go out there on Instagram or Snapchat and spread it. Write some editorials. Speak for people of your generation, because the language and the arguments around Warren being unelectable because she's female and screechy and crabby, I think those are heavily gendered, and that's part of what that's part of what is stopping a good election outcome from going forward. I'm not saying I'm for Warren or anything, but the point being that the analysis itself is very gendered. You do not hear people saying Trump is screechy and cranky, right? We describe him in other ways.
Okay. We have time for one last question, and then we'll end our panel discussion with this final question.
Oh, thank you. So in blue, California, I think this question doesn't matter, but I think it matters in the abstract all over the country, in purple states especially. So I know 4 women under the age of 30 who are all voting for Trump. They work in the service industry, hairdressers, masseuses, things like that. They're not telling anyone. And in 2016, I had a party, and 5 Democrats came up and whispered to me that they were voting for Trump, like in a confession box. So how realistic are these polling? I've heard it said that if like Trump is down by 3 points, he's won. That polling has been so off, and mostly because people are very, very reticent to tell people what they think, especially if they think they're going to get a backlash socially or economically or in the workplace.
Todd Harris.
It has certainly been an issue, and in fact, there's been quite a bit written about live phone call polling versus computerized robo-dialing when asking about Trump, and there have been some who have theorized that people are more likely to tell a computer that they're going to vote for Trump than they are a live human being. I don't know how much I buy into that, because so many of the robocall polls are just, the methodology of them is so bad that I'm just skeptical of all of the data. But if you believe that this is an issue, then it stands to reason that people might not want to tell a human that they're voting for Trump. I think you're going to see this. We heard a lot about this in 2016. I think you're going to see it a lot less this cycle, because the people who are pro-Trump are really, really pro-Trump. and they're not afraid to tell you about it. In fact, they love nothing more than telling you about it. Maybe in California, it's whispered, but you go around to the battleground states, and I don't think anyone's very shy about it there.
Doug, we're at time, but 30 seconds.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I actually think that the whole criticism of the polling industry is a bit blown out of proportion, mainly because if you look at where the polling was, national polling in 2016, and my friend Joel Bennison will back me up on this, the national polling, if you look at Real Clear Politics, or even if you can go back and look at 538 now, had it right. It had it right. That Hillary Clinton was up between 2 and 3 points. That's where she finished. The state polling also wasn't that off, but the fact is that we weren't paying attention to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. We were focusing all of our coverage and interest in Ohio and Florida, in North Carolina and Virginia and Colorado to some degree, because everyone just felt like those 3 states were sort of banked for Dems. But the polling really, I mean, anyone can go and look at this. The national polling really was not that off.
A lot of interesting issues, a lot of interesting things that we could talk about for much, much longer. But I want to thank our panel, Cesar Martinez, Professor Jane Junn, Doug Thornell, and Todd Harris. Thank you very, very much.